Every night, at exactly 12:17, my wife quietly slipped out of bed. She thought I was asleep. She always carried the same three things: a flashlight, a tape measure, and a small spiral notebook. Then she'd walk into our backyard and spend about 15 minutes measuring the exact same stretch of grass. The first time I noticed, I assumed she was planting a garden. The second time I asked what she was doing. She smiled and said, "Nothing interesting." By the 10th night, I knew she was lying. On the 23rd night, curiosity finally got the better of me. After she fell asleep, I opened the notebook she'd hidden inside her desk drawer. Every page looked almost identical. Only dates and measurements. 31 feet, 7 inches. 31 feet, 6¾ inches. 31 feet, 6½ inches. 31 feet, 6¼ inches. The distance kept getting smaller. Not by much. Less than an inch over 3 weeks. Still, it was enough for Emily to measure it every single night. The next morning I confronted her. Instead of looking guilty, she looked disappointed, almost sad. Then she quietly said something that made absolutely no sense. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice until after we moved. My name is Michael Harris. I'm 41 years old and work as an architect outside Pittsburgh. I've always trusted measurements more than instincts. Buildings either stand or they don't. Numbers are either correct or they're wrong. That's probably why Emily's behavior bothered me so much. We'd been married for 12 years. No secrets, no dramatic fights, no strange habits. Until the tape measure. We bought the house 3 years earlier. Quiet neighborhood, large backyards, old oak trees, the kind of place where people still waved from their porches and kids rode bicycles until sunset. The backyard was the reason we bought it. Nearly half an acre. One enormous white oak near the back fence. A stone patio. Plenty of room for the workshop I'd always planned to build. Emily loved that tree. Every spring she hung bird feeders from its branches. Every Christmas she wrapped it in lights. During summer evenings she'd sit beneath it with a book while I grilled dinner on the patio, which made everything even stranger. Every night she measured from the trunk of that oak to the concrete fence at the rear of our property. Always the same 2 points. Always writing the result into her notebook, never explaining why. At first I ignored it. Everyone develops harmless routines. Maybe she was planning landscaping. Maybe she wanted to build a pergola. Maybe she was comparing property lines before replacing the fence. Then I noticed something I couldn't explain. She never measured during the day. Only after midnight. Never before. Never later. Always between 12:15 and 12:30. Almost as if she were waiting for something. One Friday night I stayed awake on purpose. I waited until she quietly climbed out of bed, then followed her into the backyard. She hooked the tape measure around the oak tree, stretched it toward the fence, and checked the number under her flashlight. After writing it down, she didn't move. She simply stood there listening. Nearly 2 minutes passed. The neighborhood was completely silent. Then she whispered, "Not tonight." She reeled in the tape measure and walked back inside. I remained in the yard for several more minutes, trying to hear whatever she had been listening for. Nothing. No traffic. No animals. No voices. Only silence. By then I knew this wasn't about gardening. The following morning I measured the distance myself. Same tree. Same section of fence. Same tape measure. 31 feet, 7 inches. Exactly. I measured it again. Same result. A third time. Still the same. There was nothing unusual about the backyard. When Emily came outside carrying her coffee, she immediately noticed the tape lying in the grass. "You measured it." I did. "And?" 31 feet, 7 inches. She nodded. "I know." I frowned. "So your notebook is wrong." She looked at me for several seconds before quietly shaking her head. "No, it isn't." "Then mine is." "No, yours is right too." I stared at her. "Emily, both measurements can't be right." She smiled faintly. "They can." "How?" "You'll understand. Eventually." She picked up the tape measure and walked back into the house before I could ask another question. That answer stayed with me all day. 2 measurements, taken from the same points, both supposedly correct, unless they hadn't been taken under the same conditions. That evening I came home earlier than usual. Emily acted perfectly normal. We cooked dinner together, watched television, talked about work. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, at exactly 12:17, she stood up without a word, picked up the flashlight, notebook, and tape measure, and headed for the backyard. This time I followed her openly. She glanced over her shoulder. I wondered how long it would take. I'm done pretending I don't notice. She sighed. Fine. You can watch, but don't interrupt. The night was unusually still. Emily hooked the tape around the oak tree, stretched it toward the fence, and checked the measurement. Then, she handed me the tape. Look for yourself. I bent down beneath the flashlight. The number stopped me cold. 31 feet, 6.5 inches. Half an inch shorter than I'd measured that very morning. Before I could say anything, Emily quietly looked at her watch. 12:21. Then she whispered, "Listen." I frowned. For what? She raised one finger. 20 seconds passed. Then I heard it. A low rumble. So faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. It came from somewhere beneath our backyard. Emily closed her eyes. There it is. The sound lasted less than a minute before disappearing into silence. I looked from the tape measure to the oak tree, then back at my wife. For the first time, I realized she hadn't been measuring the yard because she expected it to change. She'd been waiting for the moment it did. Emily didn't say another word as we walked back into the house. She placed the notebook on the kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and stared out the window toward the backyard. I couldn't take it anymore. Start from the beginning. She stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she nodded. Fair enough. I first heard the sound almost 3 months ago, she said. I couldn't sleep that night, so I went outside. She pointed toward the oak tree. I noticed the tape measure because I'd left it in the garage after hanging bird feeders. Out of curiosity, I measured the distance to the fence. You measured it by accident. Exactly. The next morning I checked it again. And it was longer, by almost half an inch. I frowned. So you thought you made a mistake. I knew I had. So I measured it again the following night. She looked at me. It changed again. I leaned back in my chair. You've been checking every night since then? She nodded. I hoped I'd eventually prove myself wrong. But you didn't. No. Instead, she opened the notebook and flipped to the first page. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a list of numbers. Then I noticed another column. Weather, temperature, humidity, wind speed, cloud cover, even barometric pressure. You've been recording all this? I wanted to eliminate every obvious explanation. What did you find? She tapped one line with her finger. The weather never matched, but the movement always happened. I looked at the dates more carefully. Every measurement changed within the same 5-minute window. 12:20, 12:21, 12:22. Never before, never after. The consistency bothered me more than the movement itself. Ground doesn't keep a schedule. Machines do. The next morning I called my office and canceled every meeting. Emily didn't ask why. She already knew. You finally believe me. I believe something's happening. That's enough. As an architect, I had access to equipment far more accurate than a tape measure. By noon, I'd borrowed a digital laser level, a survey tripod, and several reflective targets from one of our construction sites. If the backyard was moving, I wanted proof. Real proof. I spent most of the afternoon establishing reference points, one target on the patio, another beside the oak tree, a third near the rear fence. Every measurement was photographed and recorded. Everything lined up perfectly, exactly as our original property survey showed 3 years earlier. If someone had inspected the yard that afternoon, they would have found nothing unusual. Emily watched me from the patio. It won't happen until tonight. You sound very certain. I am. Why? Because it never happens during the day. Just before midnight, we carried the equipment outside. The laser projected a steady red line across the yard. The digital targets showed zero movement. 12:19. Nothing. 12:20. Still nothing. Then the familiar rumble rolled beneath our feet. This time it was impossible to ignore. The laser dot trembled. Not much, just enough that both of us saw it. Then it drifted. A fraction of an inch. Another fraction. The tripod hadn't moved. The targets hadn't moved. The ground had. When the vibration stopped less than a minute later, the laser settled into a slightly different position. Only a few millimeters, but definitely different. I checked every screw on the tripod, every clamp. Everything was still locked tight. Emily quietly wrote another number into her notebook. I simply stared at the laser. For the first time in my career, I was watching solid ground move beneath my feet. Neither of us slept much that night. At sunrise, I inspected every inch of the backyard. The laser targets remained exactly where we'd left them. Nothing appeared damaged. No cracks, no sinkholes, no broken pipes. If I hadn't watched the movement myself, I would have sworn nothing had happened. That afternoon, I spread our original property survey across the dining room table. Every dimension matched the county records. The house, the fence, the oak tree. Everything looked completely ordinary, which made one question impossible to ignore. If the land really was moving, why had nobody else noticed? That evening, I walked through the neighborhood looking for answers. Most houses looked exactly as they had the day we moved in. Fresh paint, straight fences, well-kept lawns. Nothing suggested the ground beneath them was shifting. Then I reached the property directly behind ours. An older man named Richard Bennett was watering tomato plants. We'd exchanged greetings over the years, but never had a real conversation. "Evening, Richard." "Michael." He smiled. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, then decided to ask anyway. "Have you ever heard strange noises around midnight?" His smile disappeared for the briefest moment. "So, you've heard them too." I immediately noticed he hadn't asked what noises I meant. "You know what I'm talking about?" Richard slowly shut off the hose. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he looked toward my backyard, then back at me. "You should stop measuring." A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the tape measure. I hadn't even told my office why I'd borrowed the surveying equipment. "How do you know we're measuring?" Richard sighed. "Because you aren't the first family to do it." He glanced toward my house once more before lowering his voice. "The people who lived there before you started measuring too. What happened to them?" "They stopped talking to everyone. A few months later, they moved away." I felt my stomach tighten. "Did they ever tell you why?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No. But before they left, they stopped measuring the backyard." He pointed toward my house. "They started measuring the foundation." Richard's words stayed with me the entire walk home. They stopped measuring the backyard. They started measuring the foundation. That wasn't the kind of detail someone casually remembered. It sounded like something he'd watched happen. "Emily was waiting on the back porch when I got home." "You talked to Richard?" It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "He was watching us yesterday when we set up the laser." I sat beside her. "He knew about the previous owners." She looked toward the oak tree. "I figured he might. He said they measured the backyard, just like us." She slowly nodded. "And then, he said they eventually started measuring the foundation." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. I was hoping we wouldn't get there. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she stood. "Come downstairs." She led me into the basement. Nothing looked unusual at first. Storage shelves, boxes of Christmas decorations, old paint cans, the same unfinished concrete walls I'd seen hundreds of times. Emily walked directly to the rear corner of the foundation. "Look here." I leaned closer. At first I saw nothing. Then a thin diagonal crack caught the light. It was so narrow I could barely slide a fingernail into it. "I've never noticed this." "You weren't supposed to." She opened her phone and showed me 3 photographs. Each one had been taken from the exact same angle. The first was dated 6 weeks earlier. No crack. The second, taken 2 weeks later, showed the faintest hairline. The third matched what stood in front of us now. "It wasn't here when we bought the house." She shook her head. "No. I ran my fingers across the concrete. Fresh gray dust clung to my skin. The crack wasn't old. It was still growing. The next morning, I called Greg Lawson. Greg was a structural engineer I'd worked with for years. If something was wrong with the house, he'd tell me the truth instead of what I wanted to hear. He arrived carrying a laser-level crack gauges and enough equipment to inspect a commercial building. For nearly 2 hours, he checked floor elevations, door frames, foundation walls, and every visible corner of the house. Finally, he lowered his clipboard. The good news is, the house isn't failing. And the bad news? The rear corner has settled. How much? About 4 millimeters. Emily and I exchanged a glance. Greg noticed immediately. You already suspected that. I told him everything. The nightly measurements, the strange rumble, the laser drifting after midnight, Emily's notebook. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard. If what you're describing is accurate, the foundation isn't causing the movement. It's responding to it. Before leaving, Greg walked one last lap around the yard. Halfway to the oak tree, he suddenly stopped. What is it? He pointed at the grass. A shallow depression stretched across part of the lawn. It was only an inch or two lower than the surrounding ground. I'd never paid attention to it. Greg crouched beside it. When did this appear? I honestly don't know. Emily answered before I could. It wasn't there last spring. You're sure? I spend enough time in this yard to notice. Greg stood quietly. I think it's time to involve a geotechnical engineer. 3 days later, a small drilling crew arrived. Officially, they were collecting routine soil samples. Unofficially, Greg had asked them to investigate the unexplained ground movement. The first borehole near the oak tree looked perfectly normal. Topsoil, clay, gravel. Exactly what you'd expect in western Pennsylvania. The second hole was drilled beside the rear corner of the house. Everything looked normal until the drill reached about 18 feet. Suddenly, the machine lurched downward several inches. The operator immediately shut it off. That's not supposed to happen. What is it? I asked. He frowned at the depth gauge. It feels like the drill just broke through into empty space. He lowered a small inspection camera into the hole. The screen showed compact soil, then gravel, then darkness. Not loose earth, a hollow space. The camera light swept across a smooth concrete surface. The operator slowly rotated the cable. The concrete continued into the distance. This isn't natural, he said quietly. Greg stepped closer to the monitor. What are we looking at? The operator swallowed. I think there's a man-made structure under your backyard. The drilling operator carefully lowered the inspection camera farther into the opening. Everyone gathered around the monitor. The image shook for a moment before coming into focus. Concrete. Smooth, curved concrete. The beam swept across one wall, then another. This wasn't a cave. It wasn't an old sewer either. The space was far too large. Can you estimate the size? Greg asked. The operator watched the depth markings on the cable. At least 12 feet high. What about the width? I can't tell. The light isn't reaching the opposite side. Silence settled over the backyard. None of us had expected to find something like this beneath an ordinary suburban neighborhood. The camera continued descending. 20 feet, 22, 25. Then something reflected the light. Metal. The operator slowly rotated the camera. A pair of steel guide rails stretched into the darkness. Fresh tire tracks covered the concrete floor beside them. Greg frowned. Someone's been using this. I looked at him. Recently? He nodded. Those tracks haven't been there for years. Before anyone could say another word, the picture suddenly trembled. The operator frowned. I didn't move it. The image shook again. Then a bright white light appeared in the distance. Moving, slowly getting closer. The operator immediately started pulling the camera back. Too late. The light stopped directly beneath the borehole. A man wearing a white hard hat looked straight into the lens. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked annoyed. He calmly reached upward. The screen went black. A second later, the cable went slack. They cut it, the operator whispered. They knew exactly where we drilled. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "Call the county." Within half an hour, 2 sheriff's deputies and a county engineer arrived. We explained everything. The measurements, the midnight vibrations, the crack in the foundation, the hidden tunnel, the camera, the broken cable. The county engineer listened without interrupting. Then he walked to the borehole and looked down. After nearly a minute, he turned back toward us. "I've seen something like this before." That caught everyone's attention. "You have?" I asked. He nodded. "Not here. In Ohio. An abandoned utility corridor. But this." He looked toward the hole again. "This doesn't look abandoned." Before he could continue, 3 black SUVs turned onto our street. They stopped in front of my house. 4 people stepped out wearing business suits instead of construction gear. The woman leading them carried a leather portfolio. She walked directly toward us with the confident smile of someone who expected complete cooperation. "Mr. Harris?" "Yes. My name is Rebecca Sloan. I represent Keystone Environmental Services." The moment Emily heard the name, her expression changed. She leaned toward me and whispered, "That's not a real company." I looked at her. "You're sure?" She nodded without hesitation. "I've worked with environmental firms for years. I've never heard of them." Rebecca stopped beside the borehole and looked inside. For the first time, her smile faded. Then she looked back at me. "We've been informed that unauthorized drilling has taken place on this property. I drilled on my own land. Ordinarily, that wouldn't concern us." She closed the portfolio. "But in this case, it does." "Why?" She held my gaze for several seconds before answering. "Because you've uncovered infrastructure that isn't intended for public access." Greg folded his arms. "What kind of infrastructure?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that." "Then who is?" Instead of answering, Rebecca opened the portfolio. Inside was a purchase agreement. My address was already printed across the top. The offer price made me read it twice. $2,950,000. For a house worth barely $600,000. "You want to buy my property?" "As quickly as possible." "Why?" She smiled again. "It's simply the easiest solution for everyone." Emily quietly laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she'd recognized something. "They're doing it again." Rebecca looked directly at her. "I'm sorry?" Emily stepped forward. "I've seen this before." For a moment I thought it was a coincidence. She shook her head. It wasn't. Rebecca's smile disappeared completely. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked genuinely uneasy. Emily kept staring at Rebecca. "You were in Columbus." Rebecca didn't answer. "You remember me now, don't you?" For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Rebecca sighed. "I remember the project. I remember the investigation. You buried it." "No. I was told it had already been resolved." Emily shook her head. "It wasn't." "No." Rebecca glanced toward the borehole. "I suppose it wasn't." Greg stepped forward. "You've known about whatever's under this neighborhood." Rebecca looked at him. "I know there's critical infrastructure." "What kind?" "I honestly don't know." "That's convenient." She didn't argue. "I wasn't hired to build it. I was hired to buy properties whenever problems appeared." "You expect us to believe that?" "It's the truth." She looked back at me. "The offer is still valid." "I don't want your money." "You might change your mind." "I doubt it." Before anyone could continue, the drilling operator interrupted us. "I've got something." He had lowered a second inspection camera into the borehole. This one was attached to a heavier cable. The picture appeared much clearer. Concrete walls, steel rails, large electrical conduits running along the ceiling. The tunnel stretched farther than the camera light could reach. Then something appeared on the wall, a metal identification plate. The operator slowly zoomed in. The words were still readable beneath years of dust. "Platform 7, Maintenance Corridor B." Greg frowned. "Platform?" The county engineer quietly repeated the word. "That's strange." "What does it mean?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept staring at the monitor. "I've seen this naming system before." "Where?" "Large underground transport facilities. Airports. industrial complexes, but never beneath a residential neighborhood. The operator continued moving the camera. A few seconds later, the beam illuminated something even stranger. Hydraulic cylinders, massive ones, mounted beneath thick steel beams. Greg leaned closer. Those aren't supporting the tunnel. What are they supporting? No one answered. The silence ended when another vehicle pulled into the driveway. This time it wasn't an SUV. It was an unmarked state engineering truck. A middle-aged woman climbed out carrying a hard case. She introduced herself as Laura Jenkins from the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. The county engineer had called her after seeing the tunnel. She spent less than a minute studying the camera feed. Then she quietly said, "I've never seen anything exactly like this." But those hydraulic cylinders aren't there to support the tunnel. She pointed toward the screen. They're designed to move something above it. A chill ran through me. Above it? She nodded. I believe so. Greg slowly looked around my backyard, then toward the patio, then the house. Emily followed his eyes. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. We were all thinking the same thing. Laura asked the operator to pan the camera upward. The ceiling filled the screen. Perfectly flat. Reinforced concrete. Steel crossbeams every few feet. Then the laser distance meter displayed the depth. 19 feet. Laura quietly did the math. She looked at me. The ceiling of this tunnel is almost directly beneath your backyard. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Greg finally broke the silence. You're telling me our property is sitting on top of that structure? Laura nodded slowly. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Rebecca closed her eyes, almost as if she already knew what Laura was about to say. I think it's time I told you the truth. Everyone turned toward her. She looked at the tunnel one last time before speaking. The company I work for doesn't maintain this system. We manage the properties above it. What system? I asked. She hesitated, then answered quietly. A concealed underground transport corridor. For what? I honestly don't know. I've never been allowed inside. My job begins whenever homeowners start asking the same questions you're asking now. And then? We try to buy the property. If they refuse, Rebecca looked down. We wait. Emily folded her arms. So that's what happened in Columbus. Rebecca nodded. Yes. But something is different this time. What? Rebecca looked directly at the live camera feed. You found it before we expected anyone to. At that exact moment, the monitor flickered. The image shook violently. A deep metallic vibration echoed through the speakers. Then the camera light caught movement. Not a person, not a vehicle. Something enormous rolling through the tunnel in the distance. The operator froze. Whatever that is, it's coming this way. The operator pulled the camera back as quickly as he could. The picture shook violently. For a brief second, the light reflected off a massive steel machine moving along the rails. Then the signal disappeared. No one spoke. The silence was broken by Rebecca. We need to leave. Greg folded his arms. Not until someone explains what's happening. Rebecca looked genuinely frightened. I don't know everything. But I know enough to tell you this. You shouldn't be standing here tonight. Before anyone could respond, a deep rumble rolled beneath our feet, stronger than before. The patio furniture rattled. The laser tripod vibrated. One of Greg's survey targets shifted several millimeters. Laura looked at her tablet. The ground moved again. How much? Almost 5 millimeters. Greg frowned. That's more than every previous measurement. Emily opened her notebook. She quickly compared the latest reading with the previous weeks. I was right. Everyone looked at her. The movement has been increasing. She handed the notebook to Laura. I thought it was random. It isn't. Laura studied the numbers for less than a minute. No. Greg leaned over her shoulder. What? The movement isn't accelerating by itself. She pointed toward the newest measurement. It only increases after whatever passes through that tunnel. Rebecca slowly lowered her head. I was afraid of that. I looked at her. You knew. I suspected. She took a deep breath. The properties above this corridor weren't purchased because they were unsafe. They were purchased because the corridor needed constant adjustments. So every time something traveled through it, the ground shifted. She nodded. Just a little. But after enough years, the movement became permanent. Emily quietly finished the sentence. And eventually, it reached our foundation. Hair blank. Laura immediately called the State Emergency Engineering Office. Within 40 minutes, the backyard was filled with survey crews, structural engineers, and transportation officials. No one tried to hide the tunnel anymore. The first inspection confirmed what Emily's notebook had already revealed. The underground transport system had been making tiny hydraulic corrections for years. Each adjustment was almost impossible to detect. One movement meant nothing. Hundreds of them slowly changed the position of the ground above. Without realizing it, Emily had documented the entire pattern with nothing more than a flashlight, a tape measure, and remarkable patience. The investigation lasted almost a year. Engineers discovered the corridor had been built decades earlier beneath several private properties after a surveying mistake during construction. Instead of rebuilding it, contractors created a hydraulic support system designed to compensate for the error. For years it worked. Eventually, the corrections themselves began affecting the surrounding ground. The state permanently shut down the corridor. Every affected property was purchased. The tunnel was sealed, while engineers designed a safer replacement along the original public easement. Several executives involved in hiding maintenance records resigned during the investigation. Others faced criminal charges for falsifying inspection reports. Emily was called to testify during the hearings. When one investigator asked how she'd realized something was wrong, she smiled and held up the worn spiral notebook. "I couldn't sleep one night. I heard a strange sound. So I measured it." The room laughed quietly. The lead engineer didn't. He looked through every page before saying, "If you hadn't done this, we might not have discovered the problem for another decade." 6 months later, we packed the last boxes into a moving truck. Before leaving, I walked into the backyard one final time. The oak tree still stood exactly where it always had. The fence looked no different. The grass had already started growing over the places where drilling equipment once stood. If someone visited that yard, they'd never guess what had been hidden beneath it. I wrapped the old tape measure around the oak one last time and stretched it to the fence. 31 feet, 7 inches. Exactly the same number I'd measured on my very first morning in the house. I smiled. For months I believed Emily had been measuring the backyard. She hadn't. She'd been measuring the truth. And because she refused to ignore half an inch that didn't make sense, an entire hidden system was finally forced into the light.